Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to NucleCast. Of course, I am your host, Adam Lowther. And today we have a very special guest. Lucian Niemeyer is the founding partner of the United Coalition for Advanced Nuclear Power. He is, of course, a former Air Force officer. He served as a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee and was recently the Assistant Secretary of Defense who managed all of the DOD's properties and real estate. A big job because we got a lot of stuff in a lot of places. So welcome into NucleCast.
Oh, Adam, I'm really thrilled to be here with you and to be able to share some insight over the next half hour on all things nuclear. So looking forward to being able to cover a lot of ground with you.
Well, awesome. So, we normally will have DOD or NNSA folks to talk about weapons, delivery vehicles. Occasionally we talk about adversaries, but today we're going to talk a lot about nuclear power. And so as I was thinking about today's episode, I was thinking about the French nuclear program because they made a purposeful choice, 60 years ago that they wanted to be heavily reliant on nuclear power. It seems to have worked pretty well for them. The United States built a number of nuclear plants 50, 60 years ago, and then we haven't had one in 4 decades, I think is about right.
30 years.
And now we have all of these new models nuclear power. And I think this is really where your expertise comes in. So can you maybe offer the listeners sort of a broad swath of where we are now as opposed to where we were 40 years ago and help maybe dispel some of the myths of the challenges that nuclear power poses, thinking in terms of Chernobyl and then, the accident in Japan and sort of where are we now?
Yep. So, hey, first of all, I appreciate that. And believe it or not, there really is a nexus. There's a connection between what we're working in the nuclear weapon world, particularly with the triad recap, and ultimately what we're trying to do with nuclear power reactors, both on the battlefield and also for commercial use. So I'll cover that a little bit. I've been studying and working in the defense energy space for 25 years. And one of the things that I really picked up on when I became Assistant Secretary of Defense, I was not only running the real estate portfolio, but also the energy programs and environmental programs for the Department of Defense. And so we looked at, and I was actually given very specific instructions by Secretary of Defense. We want to start using small and micro reactors as a grid resiliency initiative. So there was an understanding that in a connected world, the homeland's no longer sanctuary, and our peer competitors, to include Russia right now and what they're doing to the Ukrainian grid, are going to reach out and start causing disruption or causing power outages or another way denying our ability to get reliable energy to be able to conduct national security missions as well as support society. So we started looking a while ago where nuclear power can augment other national security priorities, and we realized that you were right. In the past 30 years, our domestic nuclear energy ecosystem, our industry has atrophied. The Russians and Chinese right now are leading the way on small and next generation reactors. We have fallen behind. And so the realization was, in order for us to maintain a robust weapons nuclear program, we needed to ensure we had a robust civilian industry. And I'll give you a perfect case in point. For a while there, I was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and we had an honest discussion within the Navy. Hey, how do you tell a young kid coming out of college to be a nuclear power engineer for the Navy, but not necessarily have a career after the military? So the realization is as we are looking at the need for clean, reliable power sources, nuclear energy fits the bill. And we've seen engineering mature over the last, as you can imagine, 30 years, where the new generation of reactors that we're looking at are smaller, are definitely much more stable, and in some cases foolproof. So the goal is, how can we as a nation take a fresh look, understanding the concerns we've had, not just about safety, but also about what do we do with spent fuel rods. We've made a lot of progress in the last 30 years. And what I see is the growth of a civilian nuclear reactor industry base, which ultimately will help out the military in three ways. Like I mentioned, maintain a robust domestic supply chain, also potentially offer us power on the battlefield through modular portable nuclear reactors. And we'll talk about the Army's Pele program, or actually, I'm sorry, the Department of Defense's Pele program. And then we're also looking at putting reactors on military bases and taking those bases off the grid, so we have much more reliable power and they can't be undermined by a near-peer competitor.
Now, it's two really interesting ideas. This idea that, we're going to take nuclear power and we're going to take it to the battlefield. And for many of those who ardently oppose all things nuclear, that's going to, cause some hand waving and, some, decrying that, the safety. Could you maybe speak to that? And, how is this safe? Why do we want to do it?
So first of all, if you're really worried about it, talk to me. So we'll put some information at the end up. But look, we've been putting nuclear reactors into the battle space for 30 years. No one knows, but every time you send an aircraft carrier or a nuclear-powered submarine forward, we are using advanced reactor technology. So it's not a matter of should we do it at all. We are doing it, and there are incredible safety practices and processes set up for safely deploying a reactor into the battle space. Question is, how can we take those lessons without causing a concern for Blackwell technologies to be used on the commercial side? But how can we take that concept and create a portable reactor for land forces, just like we've done for sea forces? We decided, and God bless Admiral Rickover, we decided 50 years ago we wanted to be a nuclear fleet because we didn't want to be relying on fuel tethers and having to be resupplied. So our nuclear-powered warships can go on for months without being refueled. We need the same thing. Our near-peer competitors, the first thing they're going to do if we get into a conflict in Asia Pacific or even in Europe, they're going to cut our fuel supply, because they know without fuel supply, without technology, we won't prevail on the battlefield. So we need to come up with a source of energy, of power, that cannot be in any way denied or exploited. So from my perspective, Department of Defense, what they're doing with test reactors to be able to forward deploy those, that releases us from that tether of fuel that's so critical for us to be able to carry out our missions.
So when you talk about micro reactors on the battlefield, give us a picture of what they look like, what they do, how they remain safe.
Yeah. So first of all, a quick 30-second review. Right now, we've got 93 commercial reactors operating around the country, providing our country about 20% of its electricity needs. Each reactor is running about 1.1 to 1.3 gigawatt. All right. So they're pretty large. They've taken decades to build. In Georgia, we're still building one. So those are huge. And so when we say small reactor, that's coming in at about 500 meg or below. And that's enough to power a city. And so those are the companies like TerraPower that's looking at putting about a 300 to 400 megawatt reactor up in Wyoming on a closed coal plant. So those are the smalls. Now, when we talk micro, depending on who you talk to, they're between 20 and 30 meg of electricity. Plus, they also can put out heat, which is another great thing for a reactor. So that gives us an additional capability. That's enough to power Dallas-Fort Worth Airport continually, or a very large military installation, or a microgrid. So when we get down smaller than that, which is what we're looking at right now for the Air Force, that's down about the 5 to 10 meg. So that's enough to be able to power a base consistently. Now, Pele, which is the program within Department of Defense looking for deployment, we're down there to about 1 to 5 meg, and that's for a forward operating base. And the goal is to be able to fit that reactor into 3 Connex boxes and be able to either barge it or to ship it overseas and to be able to set it up quickly. So that would be enough for an expeditionary camp or some kind of forward location for us to operate power, and to some degree, maybe power in the local community around it.
So as I think about the picture you're describing, 3 Connex boxes at a fob, pick a country, Iraq, Afghanistan, and adversaries. The Russians are really good at artillery, long range artillery. So as Russians start barraging, an American fob, what's the safety protocols? How do we make sure that, we don't see a nuclear reactor, that's struck and, we create radiological waste?
So believe it or not, in the last 50 years, we've come up with new ways to fuel reactors. So right now we've got what they call accident tolerant fuels, that there was some type of disruption. The fuel itself would freeze up and not form of any type of radioactive threat. So there are ways, and those are being engineered into Pele for enhancing the safety of these portable reactors. Yes, I mean, do you want to put one up on a tower and be a target? No, but the way you deploy them, just like you would burn a set of generators, or you would burn a fuel bladder, you would protect as best you can the reactor. But more importantly, is if there was a direct hit on the reactor, we're talking about a lot less radioactive material, a lot less. People don't realize in this country that when we extract a spent fuel rod from a major reactor, there's still about 85% of that energy left. Matter of fact, our inventory in the United States could power our country for 100 years. So we're seeing in some cases is taking that old fuel rod, reprocessing it, and making it safer, and being able to put it in much smaller amounts into these microreactors. So the combination of the amount of radioactivity plus what we're engineering around the rod and within the rod to create new types of fuel makes it eminently safer on the battlefield.
Well, it's interesting to hear, the picture you're creating, because, I think I'm a fairly well-read guy, and, I read widely and a lot, and this is not stuff that I hear much about. I'm curious, because this is a pretty innovative, game-changing, tool. Why am I not hearing about this more? Why do I have to hear it from you?
Yeah, well, because it's there. There's a common perception. Everybody is influenced by social influencers, and unfortunately, the premier social influencer right now for nuclear energy is what you see on The Simpsons, which is dripping green goo, and that's unfortunately folks aren't looking beyond that, and then they hear about 3 Mile Island or Fukushima or Chernobyl without a clear understanding of what actually happened in those accidents. And then the realization that there are nuclear engineers and physicists who have taken those accidents and said, okay, how do we not ever let that happen again? And yes, they are experimenting out at Idaho Falls, Idaho. We have an amazing national lab out there, Idaho National Lab, that is looking at these reactors, studying the fuels. The reason why we're probably not hearing about it, we don't have one actually in advanced reactor in operation, and that's really what my nonprofit was set up to do, is take these reactors out of the test world, take Pele out of the lab, and actually put it in operation. And that's our goal over the next 5 or 6 years. And I think we'll raise awareness on the enhanced safety to the point of being meltdown proof. Everybody hears the term meltdown.
Right.
The new generation of reactors just will not melt down. And they also have other cooling mechanisms. As you know, Fukushima wasn't a core meltdown as a result of an earthquake. It was the tsunami that accompanied the earthquake that swamped the backup power for cooling. And so we've learned those lessons. So the goal is, yes, we're not talking about technology that I read about in the paper that they're comparing 50-year-old nuclear technology. We have modern technologies. No one's writing about it.
Yeah, that's, it's kind of interesting for me as a guy who focuses mostly on the weapon side, to hear about the power side, and just to, there's not a lot that's, it's not in, the mainstream press, and all you ever hear is about accidents. We don't want that. We don't. 3 Mile Island, I know a little bit about it, and I understand how much radiation was released, and it was almost nothing, but the narrative is completely different. So to me, it
was a fear factor. And look, I agree. Do we want to take that risk? 40 years ago, we stopped really building nuclear power plants because there was a risk. And even now, we're looking at clean power source. And if it wasn't for our desire to want to get to zero climate goals, I don't think you would see the Biden administration embracing nuclear power. I mean, because of the fact that there's a realization that renewable energy by itself, we're coming nowhere close to meeting our goals. We need to have nuclear power. So realism is starting to step in that nuclear power as a zero carbon is starting by itself as that solution to raise awareness among a group of folks who never would have thought about it before, because we just cannot get to our climate reduction goals without more nuclear power.
Now it's time for us to take a quick break, and we will be back. So keep joining us on NucleCast. We are back on NucleCast, and we, of course, have Lucian Niemeyer, the founding partner of the United Coalition for Advanced Nuclear Power, and we're talking about the new models, the new reactors, and what to me seems a pretty clear narrative that we're, and it's a narrative for the weapons folks where we're kind of losing it because we're we're sort of the minority out there in terms of advocating for weapons and the deterrence they provide. And on the power side, I think that the voices that oppose it are significantly greater than those that are advocating for it. How do you change the narrative? Are you getting buy-in from, say, for those that want, an all-electric America where nobody has gas cars anymore and we're all driving electric? And then we see brownouts and, California mandates that they won't sell gasoline cars, internal combustion engines anymore. And then they say, and by the way, when you buy your electric vehicle, don't charge it because we don't have the power. Are you getting, the environmental movement to support nuclear power, or are they still opposing? What's the status there?
Yeah. So, it's funny in life, you can have your own personal opinions and beliefs. And then there are those who oppose you, but you realize those who oppose you are walking right back to your solution. So California is a perfect example. Governor Newsom made it very clear that he does not want to rely on nuclear power until reality hit, until he realized that if he shut down Diablo Canyon, there were going to be blackouts and brownouts in California. So it's amazing when idealism meets realism, what ultimately prevails. So we are starting to see the idealism of an all-electric society, of a renewable energy base. And you start seeing the calculations, the amount of acreage that's going to be required for all the solar fields and all the wind farms and all the transmission. And finally, you got the idealists going, no, this is a problem. If we want to get serious about carbon reduction, it ain't going to happen with renewables only. Guess what they're now turning to? So for those who are realists about carbon reduction versus real idealists about green energy, you have to go back to nuclear being a core part of that solution. So, I may not necessarily always agree with every environmental goal we have, but in this case, it is opening the minds and aperture for those who are realists. What do we need for a blended generation base, particularly that's reliable? And we don't have a storage at scale. Nuclear is really the only clean energy option right now.
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the 15th Annual Nuclear Deterrence Summit. Come join NucleCast at the summit on February 13th through 15th, 2023 at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, Arlington, Virginia. Industry and government experts will be discussing management of the nuclear security complex, stewardship of the nuclear stockpile, arms control negotiations, and strategic policy. Stop by the NucleCast booth to say hello. Executive producer Kimberly Charrington and I will be there interviewing guests for upcoming episodes. You can find a registration link to the Nuclear Deterrence Summit with a 15% discount on the NucleCast website at anwadeter.org/NucleCast. So I can imagine, I want to go back to the defense side of it. And you created a picture for me that I can imagine of 3 Connexes burned up, protected. I didn't realize that we had created new fuels in which, they're essentially self-protecting, that we don't, that's news to me. I can only imagine it's probably news to many of the listeners. But I also want to go back to thinking about power for basing, because as I try to plan out a potential conflict with Russia or China, it seems to me that one of the first things I'm going to do if I'm the Russians or the Chinese is I'm going to launch a cyber attack against Air Mobility Command and Transcom to shut down the United States' ability to move stuff and people. And then I'm probably going to try to take out power, because, most of our bases are dependent upon commercial power. And so I can easily see targeted attacks against commercial power to stop, our bases from being able to operate in a steady state environment. So do you mentioned that you can see nuclear power being sufficient or replacing commercial power. How would you secure that? Is there, is this, because we're intimately worried about cyber attacks against power systems. So what's the cybersecurity element of these, micro reactors on bases? I can imagine it's a much smaller task because of this almost enclosed environment you can create.
So you've just hit my other love. Actually, the one that I'm devoting more time to than nuclear power is cybersecurity. So I could talk for hours about, where the grid is vulnerable, what we're doing as a nation to enhance those protections against cyber attacks, and ultimately what a nation state's interests are. I'm not as worried about a wide scale outage. I'm worried about targeted cyber attacks that inhibit our ability to deploy forces forward, or in theater. And I'm not worried about just cyber attacks, because the Russians have been trying to knock out the Ukrainian grid through cyber attacks since February. And the Ukrainians and the NATO nations and even the United States have done an amazing job of cyber defending against those attacks. And that's why they're going right back now to artillery attacks and kinetic attacks. But I agree with you. We're maybe not seeing the most sophisticated attack scenarios, cyber realm, and we definitely do have vulnerabilities in our grid. I think there are ways where nuclear power, by using distributed energy sources in an isolated and islanded grid, would protect us from a large-scale outage. And look, in the first places we're looking at doing that, believe it or not, is Alaska. Yeah. I mean, that makes kind of a lot of sense here. We've got a critical, people may not realize, we have an unbelievable array of critical assets within a couple of 100 miles from Fairbanks. We've got one of the largest radars in the world nearby. We've got a ground-based interceptor site right here near Fairbanks. We've got 2 F-35 squadrons at Allison Air Force Base, and then we've got a brigade and then some at Fort Wainwright. So that's exactly what the military is asking, the same questions you are. Where should we be looking? And if you look at the Alaskan grid, it's a little more vulnerable than ERCOT and some of the lower 42 grids. So that's where the military just a month ago put out an request for proposals for putting a micro reactor at Eielson Air Force Base. So they're moving forward on these things. They are saying, yes, this is a real threat. Yes, we need to do something on these critical assets. And we're willing to put out a proposal to get from developers, how do we station over the next few years a reactor at Eielson? So it's not just thinking about it. We're starting to take steps. My bigger concern, and God bless the folks at the Special Capabilities Office, SCO, and Department of Defense, where they're saying, look, battlefield logistics, contested environment, we're in a world of hurt right now. We've got to get in front of that. And so people start to say, okay, how we deploy these? What is the scenario? So there's a lot of thinking and discussion going on in DoD, as well as putting our money where our mouth is and getting one actually built and operating, which is what the Idaho National Lab is doing and collaborating with the Department of Defense.
So as I understand it, one of your biggest challenges is the regulation to build and field nuclear reactors, that it's just tremendous. And that's one of the big costs, is just getting through the regulatory process.
Oh, yeah.
So is there any movement to simplify that? Is there, because of the evolution of technology, are we seeing that Congress and, the president or past presidents have said, you know what, I think we're in a better place now than we were 40, 50 years ago when we were building these, this previous generation of plants, such that we now trust them and we can simplify the process? Or is it still as complex as it ever was?
Yeah, Adam, you're hitting all the right questions, and that's one of the big issues right now. You've got the Russians and the Chinese already deploying small modular reactors, and either within their own country or they're installing them in other countries. And the problem is, and that's the biggest risk to this particular industry, is if they're not designed safely, if there's not a real good look at the engineering, and if one goes bad, it kills the entire industry. So yes, I'm a big fan of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They've been providing a safe review for both engineering and construction for the last 40 years for us. And they should continue to take a look at even this new generation of reactors and making sure that we are providing the safest engineering design that we can. Now, I would say, though, that the process has taken way too long. And Congress, in their own way, made it even harder. Back in the 70s, they required developers to self-fund the NRC process, which could be up to $1 billion, just the licensing process. So it has really killed innovation. So, yes, there are efforts in Congress right now to maintain the rigor of the review, but to acknowledge that there's two new technologies that are out there, and to maybe expedite the review of those technologies and shorten the process. Because right now, an NRC license can take anywhere from 3 to 5 to 7 years. We've got to move, if nothing more, to meet our climate goals. We've got to move so much quicker on getting from a test reactor to actually getting one operating on the grid. So yes, Congress is looking at that. They are putting pressure on NRC. Their NRC is supposed to be coming back with some suggestions on how to expedite the process, but we're going to need to do that because we're not looking at the same engineering that built these reactors from the 60s on this gigantic 100-acre site. We're looking at an assembly line in a factory. How can you use that compactness, that automation, the use of AI to help build these things, and then address that in the engineering review process, saying, we don't necessarily need to go through a year of material testing. We've got this in a couple of weeks. So those are the types of things we're working right now with the NRC.
Now, you mentioned in the opening of our discussion that there's a tie between the weapons side and the power side. Can you maybe offer some discussion? What is that tie? Because I don't necessarily think all of our listeners understand that.
Yeah, so we the United States have led the world with nuclear energy development and nuclear weapon development since World War II, and they kind of feed off each other because of the fact if you're spending money in one area that's related, you have a tendency to bring down the cost in another area. And one of the co-founders of UCAN Power, that's what we call ourselves, David Charrington, who also works with ANWA, saw that even in his Senate days. On if you're promoting a range of initiatives, you're ultimately going to bring down the cost overall because of some overlapping technology, overlapping development. So we have allowed our civilian nuclear industry to atrophy over the last 30 years, where we're starting to now add costs for the one-offs or on the nuclear weapons side. Mm-hmm. So the goal is, and the goal of my nonprofit is to work on initiatives that restore our domestic supply chain from enrichment of uranium to processing of uranium, to the development of the specialty metals and the piping and all the things we need that need to be certified for nuclear use, that ultimately will help us as we're recapitalizing our land-based nuclear fleet. So there's definitely economies of effort to be gained, and more importantly, the restoration of workforce expertise. We are atrophying as a nation if we are not investing in our nuclear engineers, our nuclear scientists, to want to continue to work both on the weapons side and on the civilian side. So the goal is, how do you reward that workforce? How do you keep them engaged on innovation to drive both sides?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I'm thinking back to an earlier part of our discussion where you talked about the Navy, and I actually have a son. He's only 12 now, but he wants to go into the Navy like Dad. But he said, Dad, when I get out, I want to make at least $150,000 a year. And I thought, well, geez, I'm not sure what jobs pay that when you get out of the Navy. And so we started looking it up, and, your nuclear power operators, your nuclear reactor operators, they do fairly well. And so I said, well,
and cybersecurity too. If you want to come out of the Navy with a cyber background, you'll make a lot of money real fast.
Yeah. And it goes to your point that, for somebody to want to do it in the Navy, And I had a few friends in the Navy that's what they did. And they got out and they work in Arkansas and other places. And you got to have places for them to work. And then it also makes me think about, I'm a Texan. And so as an expat living outside my country, I read Texas Monthly, and there was a big series of articles about the big power outage. And one of the aspects that we, a few years ago, and one of the aspects of it was that you lost your renewables. Your solar was covered in snow. It was a comedy of challenges, but to me it seems that one of the solutions to that, when the rare times Texas is just coated in snow, is that nuclear power offers you an alternative.
First of all, ERCOT was a tragedy, and because we lost over 200 folks due to that power outage. And look, to me, the reliability of our grid trumps any issue that we're trying to address when it comes to energy. As a Secretary of Defense, I had to testify before Congress about the range of threats, resiliency threats. And yes, I get it. A lot of folks are committed to environmental, the environmental threat, severe weather threat, carbon reduction goals. I'm sorry. I get it. But what I want is reliable power. I don't want to kill people today because the power goes out. I don't want to, allow us to be taken down by a cyber attack. So when you look at investments, reliability has to be the top priority. Now, ERCOT, that was a series of missteps. I mean, they just had not designed some of their grid for the cold weather they received.
Sure.
And believe it or not, even the nuclear power plants had some issues maintaining capacity during that outage. And then you throw in, the wind underperformed, and so it was a comedy. It wasn't a comedy. I'm so sorry. I don't want to say that. It was not a comedy. It was a tragedy. But it was a collaboration of issues related to the extreme cold weather that led to that. So yes, we should invest in that. More nuclear on that particular grid. Yes. I mean, I think we do have to acknowledge reality that renewables are intermittent, and unfortunately, intermittent power without scaled storage kills. I mean, that even goes for hydropower. That we're starting to see some issues in the Northwest. So I would want to emphasize protection of human life is the highest priority. Now, whether that means more nuclear or better storage or storage at scale, that's what we need to figure out on the economics of what works nationwide.
So we're at the end of the show. It's been an interesting discussion. I've learned a lot today. So I always appreciate when you do a show and you learn a lot. That's good. If you want to leave our listeners with something, a takeaway, what is that takeaway?
It's something actually that the Biden administration said, that we cannot meet realistically our carbon reduction goals and our reliability priorities. Because remember, I'm not going to sacrifice reliability for anything else without investing in advanced reactors, in the next generation of nuclear power. And that, to me, is become the reason why we are working so hard to make this reality, to raise awareness, is we've got to educate folks on the science, not the fear, not the 60-year-old technology, but what exists today at Idaho National Lab, what is being invested in by the Department of Defense, Department of Energy on the next generation reactors that will address the concerns that we have as a nation about safety and about spent fuel storage. So I'm asking your viewers, get educated, stop relying on fear, look at the science, look at what's happening right now with nuclear energy, and then make the realization and come to the realization that I have, that we definitely need this power source commensurate with other power sources to truly meet our increased electrification demands over the next 40 years. All
right. Lucian Niemeyer, thanks for joining us on NucleCast.
Oh, Adam, it's a thrill, and I would love to continue to come back, and we'd love to talk cybersecurity. I'm going to try to convince your son to get into that profession as well. So.
He's already told me, Dad, I don't want a job where I have to sit at a desk.
Yeah, well, cybersecurity and nuclear power can be exciting. The only problem is when you're getting off your desk in nuclear energy, it's normally not for a good reason.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And to the listeners, we'll see you next time on NucleCast.
All right. Sounds good.
Well, we just had a great interview with Lucian Niemeyer, and we talked a lot about the current state of nuclear power. And it was something I just didn't know much about. I knew a little bit because I read and I occasionally hear some stuff, but I didn't know we had self-protecting fuel rods, and we had ways to put nuclear power plants in 3 Connex containers and take them to the battlefield, and just the state of the technology. It was pretty interesting. So hopefully you'll enjoy it, and let me know what you think.